England fought France for over a century. In that time, English armies destroyed French forces at Crécy, at Poitiers, at Agincourt, battles so one-sided that chroniclers struggled to explain them. Generation after generation, France fielded larger armies, fought on home soil, and lost. The English longbowman became the most feared soldier in the known world. English kings sat in Paris. An English infant was crowned King of France in Notre Dame Cathedral. And then, England lost everything, every acre of French soil, every castle, every claim. The greatest military winning streak of the medieval age ended with one kingdom transformed into a European superpower, and the other collapsing into 30 years of civil war so savage it nearly destroyed the royal bloodline entirely. One side won every battle. The other side won the war. The question of how that happens, how a nation can dominate so completely and lose so absolutely, is one of the most revealing questions in the history of power itself. To understand how the 100 Years' War began, you have to start with a paradox so strange that medieval lawyers spent decades arguing about it and never fully resolved it. The King of England held land in France, not as a conqueror, not as an occupier, as a vassal, a lord who technically owed submission and loyalty to the French crown. And the land he held was not some windswept northern borderland. It was among the richest territory in all of Western Europe. It had started with a wedding. When Henry II of England married Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152, the English crown acquired the vast southwestern duchy of Aquitaine almost by accident, a territory stretching from the Loire to the Pyrenees, larger than many kingdoms. Over the following decades, capable French kings began chipping it back. By the early 14th century, only the southwestern corner remained in English hands, the Duchy of Gascony, anchored on the port city of Bordeaux. What Gascony lacked in size, it more than compensated for in wealth. The land was built on wine. Bordeaux and the surrounding countryside produced some of the finest vintages in Europe, and England was its primary market. By the early 1300s, Bordeaux was exporting roughly 80,000 barrels of wine per year, a quarter of it bound for England. In 1327 alone, the revenues flowing from Gascony to the English crown exceeded the combined tax receipts of England, Wales, and Ireland. The duchy was not a sentimental attachment. It was a financial engine. The Gascons themselves had little desire to become French. Their language was not French. It was Gascon, a distinct tongue with its own literature and cadence. Their economy was oriented toward England, not Paris. Their merchant families had grown rich, supplying English households, English nobles, and English kings with wine for generations. The French chronicler Jean Froissart noted that contemporaries simply called the Gascons English. The duchy's population had more in common with Bristol merchants than with the knights of the Ile-de-France, but the arrangement carried a hidden fault line. The English king held Gascony not as a sovereign in his own right, but as a duke, which meant technically as a subject of the French crown. He was required to perform an act of homage to the French king, kneeling and acknowledging himself as a vassal. For a monarch who ruled his own independent kingdom, this ritual was humiliating in a way that went beyond ceremony. It placed the two kings in a relationship that was legally coherent and politically impossible at the same time. The Treaty of Paris in 1259 had crystallized this arrangement. Henry III of England formally renounced most of his continental claims in exchange for confirmed possession of Gascony, but only as a vassal of France. What was meant to be a settlement became, in retrospect, one of the longest fuses in European history. Contemporary lawyers and diplomats recognized even then that no practical solution existed. An English king could not truly serve as a French subject. A French king could not indefinitely tolerate a foreign monarch holding a wealthy duchy inside his own borders. Tension ran through the following decades like a current. French kings gradually expanded their authority and bureaucratic reach, centralizing power in ways that made the semi-autonomous status of Gascony harder to sustain. English kings repeatedly found their Gascon subjects appealing to French courts, French officials intervening in local disputes, and French armies probing the duchy's borders when relations soured. The war had not started yet, but its machinery was already turning. The immediate trigger came not from Gascony, but from a death with no heir. On the 31st of January 1328, Charles IV of France died. He was the last king of the direct Capetian line, the dynasty that had ruled France unbroken since the 10th century. He left no son. He left a pregnant widow whose child, when born, turned out to be a daughter. The most powerful throne in Christendom was suddenly vacant, and the rules governing who could claim it were about to be contested with considerable violence. Edward III of England had a strong claim. His mother Isabella was Charles IV's sister, making Edward the dead king's nephew the closest surviving male relative of the Capetian bloodline. But the French magnates did not want a foreign king, and they argued, with whatever legal justification they could assemble, that the throne could not pass through the female line. They chose instead Philip of Valois, a cousin of the dead king through the male line, who became Philip VI. Edward was young, England was politically unstable, and he accepted the decision. In 1329, he traveled to France and knelt before Philip to perform homage for Gascony. He would not kneel again. Over the following years, as Edward consolidated his grip on England and grew into the formidable king he would become, his resentment of that humiliation hardened into something more calculated. Philip, for his part, did nothing to ease the tension, supporting Scotland against England, harboring fugitives, and interfering in Gascon governance. By 1337, Philip declared Gascony forfeit. Edward's response was to declare himself King of France. What had been a legal paradox for 80 years became a war that would last for more than a century. When Edward III went to war with France, he faced a fundamental problem. France was larger, richer, and more populous. The French crown could summon more knights, feed more men, and sustain a longer campaign. By every conventional medieval measure of military power, England should have lost every time it set foot on French soil. That it did not, that England won battle after battle for 3 full generations, had almost nothing to do with noble courage or royal genius, and almost everything to do with a weapon that France never understood and never properly countered: the English longbow. The longbow was not a sophisticated piece of technology. It was a shaft of yew wood, roughly 6 feet long, strung with linen or hemp. What made it extraordinary was not its construction, but the body that drew it. A fully trained English archer could loose an arrow every 5 to 6 seconds, 10 to 12 shots per minute, with enough force at close range to punch through the plate armor of a mounted knight. A crossbow, the weapon France relied on for its missile troops, fired 2 or 3 bolts per minute at best. In the time a Genoese crossbowman reset his weapon once, an English archer had already loosed 5 arrows. The physical cost of mastery was written permanently into the body. The skeletons of medieval English archers are identifiable at a glance. The left arm bone is measurably larger and longer than the right. The shoulders are asymmetrical, and the spine shows the characteristic deformations of decades of extreme lateral stress. A man who drew a 150-pound warbow from boyhood did not merely practice a skill. He reshaped his own skeleton around it. There was no shortcut. The only way to produce an effective longbowman was to start him young and never stop. England understood this and built an entire legal architecture around it. As early as 1252, the assize of arms required every able-bodied man between 15 and 60 to own a bow and know how to use it. Edward I had banned most Sunday sports so that the population would spend their leisure hours shooting instead. By 1363, Edward III went further, mandating archery practice on all Sundays and holidays, and forbidding, on pain of death, any sport that consumed time better spent at the butts. The English village green was, in a very practical sense, a military training ground. The result was something that no other European kingdom possessed, a deep, self-replenishing national reserve of men who had spent their entire lives learning to kill at range. When Edward III needed archers, he did not have to improvise. He drew from a pool of trained yeomen who had been shooting since childhood, men who could maintain a combat rate of fire under pressure, in poor weather, on broken ground, against targets that were moving, armored, and closing fast. France could not replicate this. Training a crossbowman took weeks. Training a longbowman to full effectiveness took years and required a social commitment to the weapon that France had never made. Edward III's other innovation was equally ruthless, though it required no bow at all. The chevauchée, a word that translates loosely as a mounted raid, was economic warfare, stripped of all pretense. An English army, moving fast and light across French territory, did not primarily seek to capture cities or destroy opposing armies. It sought to destroy everything that sustained the French war economy. Crops burned before harvest, mills smashed, barns emptied, livestock slaughtered or driven off, entire villages reduced to ash. The population fled to the nearest fortified town, and the countryside behind the raiding columns was left unable to produce tax revenue for the French crown for years. This was not casual brutality. It was deliberate strategy, and Edward III had refined it against the Scots before turning it on France. A chevauchée served multiple purposes simultaneously. It stripped revenue from the French king. It demonstrated to the French population that their monarch could not protect them, an attack on royal legitimacy as much as on agricultural production. And it invited the French army to give battle on terrain and terms chosen by the English, usually against a smaller, more disciplined force that had prepared its defensive position in advance. The French rarely declined the invitation, and they almost always suffered for accepting it. England's third structural advantage was less visible but equally consequential: the contract army. French medieval warfare operated largely on the feudal principle. A king summoned his great lords, who summoned their vassals, who arrived with retinues of variable quality, uncertain discipline, and intense personal pride. An English army, by contrast, was increasingly built on indentures, legal contracts between the crown and military captains specifying exact numbers of men, their equipment, their pay rates, and the length of their service. The men who came under these contracts were professionals. They fought for money, which meant they answered to command rather than to honor. The difference became visible the moment a battle began. French armies of the 14th century were dominated by armored knights for whom the mounted charge was not merely a tactic, but an expression of social identity. To refuse battle, to retreat, to dismount and fight on foot, these things felt, to the French nobility, like a kind of shame. English commanders had no such inhibitions. Edward III thought in terms of ground, formation, and killing efficiency. He placed his men-at-arms dismounted at the center, anchored his flanks with archers, dug pits, and planted stakes to break cavalry charges, and waited. He let France's greatest asset, its heavy cavalry, come to him. The men France sent against him were among the finest horsemen in Europe, bred to war, armored to the teeth, and almost entirely unsuited to the battlefield Edward had prepared. The longbow's bodkin arrowhead, a narrow, hardened point designed for exactly this task, could penetrate most plate armor at close range. The panicking horses were easier targets still. A cavalry charge that broke apart under arrow fire before it reached the English line became a chaos of fallen men and thrashing animals directly in the path of the next charge. Edward III had engineered a killing system, and France, in its pride, obliged him by walking into it again and again. In July of 1346, Edward III loaded the largest English fleet ever assembled, somewhere in the order of 700 ships, and crossed the Channel to Normandy. He landed at Saint-Vest-la-Hougue in the Cotentin Peninsula without serious resistance. His army, roughly 14,000 strong, came ashore into one of the richest and most densely populated regions of France, a land that had not seen war in a generation. What followed was not an invasion in the traditional sense. It was a demonstration. The English columns moved southeast and then north, burning as they went. Caen fell within days and was sacked for 3 days. 3,000 of its people were killed, and barges were filled with looted goods and sent back across the Channel. The army turned toward Paris, raiding parties reaching as far as Saint-Cloud and Saint-Germain, close enough that Parisians could see the smoke. Philip VI watched from within his capital as his villages burned, powerless to intercept a force that moved faster than his ability to concentrate against it. The humiliation was deliberate and total. Philip eventually assembled a large army and gave chase. For days, the two forces moved in parallel across northern France, the French trying to cut off the English at the Somme, the English slipping away until they found a crossing. When they finally turned to fight, Edward chose his ground with the cold precision that defined everything he did. He positioned his army on a sloping ridge near the village of Crécy, facing south, on the afternoon of the 26th of August, 1346. He dismounted his men-at-arms, planted his archers on the flanks, had pits dug in front of the position, and waited. Opposite him, Philip VI commanded somewhere between 25,000 and 35,000 men, the flower of French military society. At the front of his column rode 6,000 Genoese crossbowmen, the finest mercenary missile troops in Europe. Behind them came wave after wave of armored knights, the pride of the French nobility, mounted on war horses bred for exactly this kind of engagement. Everything about the French army expressed the same fundamental conviction that heavy cavalry, led by great lords, was the decisive force in battle, and that lesser men did not decide the fate of kingdoms. The Genoese advanced first, but they had marched all day, and their bowstrings had been wet by a sudden thunderstorm. They were still advancing toward the English line, loosing bolts at moderate range, when the English archers stepped forward and unleashed. 7,000 longbows firing at 10 to 12 arrows a minute filled the air with a density of missiles that contemporary chroniclers compared to snowfall. The Genoese crossbowmen, outranged and overwhelmed, broke and fled. At that moment, the Count of Alençon, watching from behind, screamed at his knights to advance. France's own cavalry rode straight through the men they had hired to protect them. The knights charged through the debris of their own fleeing infantry and came up the slope toward the English line. The archers turned on them. A longbow's bodkin arrowhead would not always penetrate plate armor at long range, but the horses were different, unarmored, terrified by the noise, stumbling in the pits that Edward's soldiers had dug across the slope. Horses screamed and fell, riders were thrown. The men who made it through the arrow storm met the English dismounted men-at-arms on foot. They were exhausted from the charge and the slope. The disciplined English infantry cut them down. Philip charged 15 times that afternoon. 15 times the greatest cavalry in Europe rode uphill into English arrows and met English infantry at the top. Each charge was more disordered than the last. The fallen, men and horses alike, accumulated on the slope until the ground itself became an obstacle to the next advance. Among the fallen was John of Bohemia, an elderly, blind king who had come to fight for the honor of it, found afterwards with the reins of his horse still tied to those of his knights, who had guided him into the heart of the battle together. His crest of 3 ostrich feathers was taken by the Black Prince. The Prince of Wales carries those feathers still. When the carnage ended, Philip VI had fled the field, wounded by an arrow, his army shattered. He lost somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 men. The English lost fewer than 300. Among the fallen were the highest nobility of the kingdom, 11 princes, 1,200 knights. The men who died at Crécy were not simply soldiers. They were the administrative, military, and political leadership of French aristocratic society. Their estates were left without heirs. Their families were crippled by the debts their fathers had taken on to equip themselves for the campaign. Edward did not pursue. He had no need to. He marched north to the Channel coast and in early September laid siege to Calais, the closest French port to England, directly across the water from Dover. Calais held out for 11 months. Its garrison finally surrendered in August 1347. Gaunt with starvation, its citizens reduced to eating whatever they could find inside the walls. Edward expelled the entire French population and resettled the town with English colonists. Calais would remain English for over 200 years. What Crécy revealed was not simply that the English longbow was effective. Armies had faced longbows before and survived. What it revealed was a structural incompatibility between the way France organized and commanded its military and the battlefield that Edward III had designed. France's knights charged because their culture demanded it. Because to hold back was dishonor. Because the men watching expected glory. England's commanders designed the battlefield specifically to turn that honor into a killing mechanism. The question was whether France understood what had happened to it. The answer, for now, was no. In the autumn of 1347, with Calais secured and Philip VI humiliated, everything was in place for England to press its advantage. Edward III returned home in triumph. France was financially broken, politically fractured, and militarily spent. The nobility that had survived Crécy was crippled by ransom debts. Philip could not raise taxes fast enough to fund a response. Several French lords had already made quiet contact with the English, offering their allegiance. A campaign in 1348 could, conceivably, have changed the war entirely. It never came. The disease had no name yet when it arrived. The people of the time called it the Great Mortality, the Pestilence, the Great Death. It had originated somewhere in the grasslands of Central Asia years earlier, moving westward along the trade routes, arriving in Constantinople in the autumn of 1347, and reaching the Mediterranean ports of Italy and France almost simultaneously. It came to England from Gascony, carried in the hold of a merchant ship that docked at the Dorset port of Melcombe Regis in June 1348. Within weeks it was in Bristol. By autumn it was in London. By the following summer it had covered the entire country. Nothing in the experience of medieval Europe had prepared its people for what followed. The disease killed within days. Its victims developed swellings, buboes, across the body, darkening beneath the skin, accompanied by raging fever and a physical deterioration so rapid and so total that survivors struggled to describe what they had witnessed. In some areas, the pneumonic form took hold, spreading through the air from one breath to the next, killing almost everyone it reached. Priests went into infected households to administer last rites and did not come back. Doctors who entered the sick rooms of the afflicted rarely emerged. Villages lost half their people in a month, sometimes more. France was struck first and struck harder in the initial wave. The disease swept through the densely populated cities of the south, Marseille, Avignon, Montpellier, before moving north through the Loire Valley and into Paris. In some parishes, records of burial simply stop partway through the year, the clerks who maintain them gone alongside those they had recorded. Philip VI himself survived, but his queen, Joan of Burgundy, died of the plague in 1349. Edward III's daughter Joan, traveling through Gascony on her way to a royal marriage in Castile, died of the pestilence at Bordeaux in the summer of 1348. She was 15 years old. The truce that had been signed after Calais held and then kept holding, not because either side chose restraint, but because neither side could function. The machinery of medieval warfare ran on men and money. The plague consumed both. Tax collection collapsed as the officials who levied it died alongside the people who paid it. Armies could not be raised from populations reduced by a third or more. The great lords who had survived the battlefield died in their manors. Their heirs, many of them children, inherited titles and debts and no means to discharge either. The plague did not descend once and withdraw. It returned. A second wave struck in the early 1360s, a third in the 1370s, a fourth in the 1380s. Each time, populations that had barely begun to recover were struck again. England's population, roughly 5 million before the first outbreak, fell to under 2 million by the middle of the following century and did not recover to pre-plague levels for nearly 200 years. France's losses were proportionally similar, though concentrated more heavily in its densely populated urban centers and northern farming heartlands. The men who survived the plague and eventually returned to the business of war had changed. The great lords who had defined both kingdoms' political cultures before 1348 were, many of them, dead. Their successors were younger, less experienced, and holding power over estates whose labor force had been halved. The peasants who remained alive found themselves with an entirely new kind of leverage. Their labor was scarce, their services competed for, their willingness to stay on the land no longer guaranteed. The feudal relationships that had underpinned both kingdoms' military systems were loosening, though neither crown yet understood what this meant. The other legacy of the plague years was something that would haunt France for generations: the routiers. When armies disbanded, as they repeatedly did during the truces forced by the pestilence, the soldiers in them did not simply go home to peaceful lives. Many had no peaceful lives to return to. Instead, they formed companies, organized bands of armed men who sustained themselves by doing to the French countryside exactly what English armies had done during the chevauchée, but without any king's purpose in behind it. They burned, looted, kidnapped for ransom, and sold their services to whoever would pay. By the 1350s, bands of routiers were operating across a third of France, answering to no one, destroying the agricultural economy of regions the English army had never even reached. In the autumn of 1355, Edward the Black Prince rode out of Bordeaux at the head of roughly 6,000 men and turned east into the heartland of southern France. He was 25 years old and his father's most capable commander. What followed was one of the most destructive military operations of the entire war. His columns spread across a front 50 miles wide, moving systematically through the wealthy provinces of Languedoc, burning every settlement they reached, destroying mills and orchards, slaughtering livestock, leaving nothing behind that the French crown could tax. Over the course of 2 months, more than 500 towns and villages were reduced to ash. The strategic logic was cold and deliberate. Languedoc was among the richest provinces in France, a vital source of royal revenue. The Black Prince was not trying to hold it. He was trying to make it worthless. Every acre of scorched farmland was a direct subtraction from Jean II's capacity to fund his armies, pay his officials, and maintain the loyalty of his nobility. Jean watched from the north, unable to intervene effectively. His military reputation, already damaged by a decade of English raids, was being openly destroyed in front of his subjects. The following year, the Black Prince rode north again. Near the town of Poitiers, in September 1356, a French army caught him. Jean II had perhaps 3 times the English numbers and the advantage of having chosen when to fight. The French had learned something from Crécy. They dismounted most of their knights and advanced on foot to deny the English archers the same killing ground they had exploited a decade before. It was a sensible adaptation. It was not sensible enough. The English position was on a ridge, anchored by hedgerows, with archers covering every approach. The French infantry, advancing uphill in heavy armor in the heat of September, exhausted themselves before they reached the English line. The 3rd Division, led personally by Jean II with a battle-axe in hand, was hit in the rear by a cavalry charge the Black Prince had held in reserve. It collapsed. Jean II of France was taken prisoner on the battlefield at Poitiers. His youngest son, Philip, 14 years old, had fought beside his father and refused to flee even when the line broke. The Earl of Warwick rode through the chaos, formally accepted the king's surrender, and led him away. The most powerful monarch in Western Europe was now a prisoner in English custody, and the ransom his captors would demand, 3 million gold écus, was a sum that France had no realistic means to pay. The Black Prince entertained his royal prisoner that evening with elaborate courtesy, serving him at table, and brought him in triumph to London the following spring. Jean would spend 4 years in comfortable captivity in England while his kingdom disintegrated around him. What followed in France in the years after Poitiers was not simply political confusion. It was a systemic collapse. The Dauphin Charles, a young man of 20, physically frail and politically inexperienced, found himself ruling a kingdom without its king, without functioning revenue, without military leadership, and without the confidence of either its nobility or its common people. Etienne Marcel, the provost of merchants of Paris, seized on the moment to press the urban bourgeoisie's long-standing grievances against royal government. He effectively controlled Paris, dictating terms to the Dauphin, organizing the Estates General to challenge royal authority, and at one point having 2 of the Dauphin's closest advisors cut down in his own chamber while the prince stood helpless. In the countryside, the crisis was even rawer. The free companies, the routiers, had multiplied in the years of truce and now spread across 1/3 of France without restraint. When the Dauphin, attempting to blockade Paris against Marcel, ordered his nobles to fortify and provision their castles, the peasants along the river valleys understood the order as a prelude to new extortion. On the 28th of May, 1358, a group of peasants north of Paris killed 9 noblemen. Within days, the uprising had spread from Normandy to Champagne, the largest rural revolt France had ever seen. They called it the Jacquerie, after the contemptuous name the nobles gave to peasants, Jacques Bonhomme. Assel were stormed, their inhabitants shown no mercy. The fury was specifically directed at the men who had abandoned the countryside to the English and the routiers while continuing to collect their dues. The Jacquerie lasted less than 2 months before it was crushed. The reprisals that followed were, by most measures, more devastating than the revolt itself. But the damage it revealed was permanent. The agricultural infrastructure of northern France had been ravaged twice over, first by a decade of English chevauchée, then by the Jacquerie and its suppression. Etienne Marcel was murdered by his own faction in July 1358, ending the Parisian revolt. But Charles of Navarre, a man with his own claim to the French throne and the opportunism to use it, remained a threat the Dauphin had to manage constantly. France, in the autumn of 1358, was a kingdom in name more than in fact. England held all the leverage and appeared to understand it. Edward III marched an enormous army to the walls of Paris in 1359, intending to force a final settlement. The Dauphin refused to come out and fight. The French towns shut their gates and waited. Edward, running short of supplies, could not sustain a siege of the capital and eventually withdrew. He had demonstrated again that France could not protect itself. He had also demonstrated, without quite realizing it, the limit of the chevauchée as a decisive instrument. It could destroy and humiliate without end, but could not by itself force a surrender. The Treaty of Bretigny was signed in 1360. In its terms, Edward III received full sovereignty over an expanded Aquitaine, all the lands the English had held at the height of their power, plus Calais and Poitiers, in exchange for formally renouncing his claim to the French throne. Jean II was released when a third of his ransom had been paid, leaving French hostages in England as security for the rest. England had won everything its armies had been fighting for across 2 decades. France had signed away more than a third of its territory without a single major battle going in its favor. But the treaty contained within it the seed of its own reversal. The Dauphin who signed it was 22 years old and had spent the worst years of his kingdom's history learning to govern. He had watched his father humiliated, his city revolt, his countryside burn, and his peasants rise. He had survived Etienne Marcel and Charles of Navarre and the Routiers and the English army beneath his walls. He had not forgotten any of it. When he became King Charles V of France 4 years later, he began quietly and methodically to change everything. Charles V became King of France in 1364. He was known as Charles the Wise, though his enemies called him Charles the Lame. His spine was deformed from birth, and he suffered chronic pain throughout his life. He was not a soldier. He would never personally lead an army in the field. What he was a man of exceptional intelligence who had spent the worst years of any medieval French prince's experience watching every conventional response to England fail, and who had reached a conclusion that almost no one around him was willing to accept, that France could not beat England in battle and should therefore stop trying. His instrument was a Breton knight named Bertrand du Guesclin. Du Guesclin was born around 1320 in Brittany, the eldest son of a minor lord, not the rank that typically produced constables of France. He was famously ugly, broad-shouldered, combative, and illiterate. He had spent 2 decades fighting in the guerrilla campaigns of the Breton succession wars, learning a kind of warfare that had nothing to do with the great set-piece encounters at Crécy and Poitiers. He knew how to raid, how to ambush, how to take a castle through siege and patience, and, most importantly, how to make an enemy's presence in a territory unbearable without ever giving that enemy the pitched battle it wanted. Charles appointed du Guesclin Constable of France in October 1370, the highest military office in the kingdom. It was a deliberate provocation to the French nobility, for whom the constableship was one of the great dignities of the realm, normally reserved for men of the highest birth. Du Guesclin's appointment announced without ambiguity that Charles intended to run his military on a basis of professional competence rather than aristocratic precedent. The nobles resented it. The strategy worked. The pretext for renewing the war arrived in 1369. The Black Prince, ruling Aquitaine from Bordeaux, had returned from a ruinous campaign in Spain, badly in debt and in deteriorating health. To recover his finances, he imposed a hearth tax across his Gascon subjects. The Gascon lords appealed to Charles V, claiming he retained ultimate sovereignty over Aquitaine despite the Treaty of Bretigny. Charles summoned the Black Prince to Paris to answer the complaints. The prince responded that he would come, but with his helmet on his head and 60,000 men at his back. Charles declared the treaty void and resumed the war. The English expected what had always come before: French armies marching out to meet them, French cavalry charging into arrow storms, French kingdoms handing over their sons as ransom. Du Guesclin gave them none of it. When English forces launched chevauchés into French territory, as they had done every generation for 30 years, the French armies shadowed them, harassed their supply lines, cut off stragglers, and refused to concentrate for a decisive engagement. The English columns burned what they burned and marched back to their garrisons, having accomplished nothing of strategic value. While the English were marching and burning, Du Guesclin was besieging. Castle by castle, town by town, he worked through the English-held territories of Aquitaine with methodical patience. His preferred weapon was the siege, not the field battle. He picked off English garrisons one at a time, in locations the enemy could not defend simultaneously. When English relief forces marched to counter him, he avoided them and resumed elsewhere. The French liberated over 130 castles and towns in Aquitaine between 1369 and 1377. England, with no standing army and no treasury large enough to pay for permanent garrisons across hundreds of positions, could not keep pace with the attrition. The psychological effect on England's armies was severe. John of Gaunt led a great chevauchée in 1373. 10,000 men marching from Calais all the way to Bordeaux, a journey of over 900 miles through the heart of France. Charles issued strict orders. Farmers were to take their goods and retreat behind city walls. Soldiers were to follow and harass, but not to fight. The English columns moved through a landscape emptied of everything useful. French cavalry picked off stragglers and foraging parties. By the time Gaunt's army reached Gascony, it had lost perhaps half its strength to hunger, disease, and the accumulated cost of constant small engagements. It had not fought a single major battle. It had achieved nothing. The Caroline strategy succeeded because it matched the specific weaknesses of the English system against the specific strengths of the French position. England fought abroad, at the end of long supply chains, with armies recruited through contracts that had fixed durations. Every campaign had to produce results quickly enough to justify the cost before the contracts expired, and the men went home. France fought at home, on terrain its commanders knew, with a population that could be organized to deny the enemy resources. Du Guesclin could sustain his strategy indefinitely. The English could not sustain their campaigns indefinitely. Time, in the Caroline phase, worked entirely in France's favor. By the time Charles V died of illness in September 1380, and Du Guesclin had preceded him by 2 months, dying of fever while on campaign, the political map of France had been transformed. English-held territory had been reduced from the vast domains secured at Bretigny back to a narrow coastal strip in Gascony, plus Calais. Everything else had been recovered, not by defeating English armies in the field, but by making English occupation too expensive, too difficult, and too exhausting to sustain. England had been beaten by a strategy it had no answer to and barely recognized as a strategy at all. The tragedy of the Caroline phase, for France, was that it demonstrated something that France itself failed to institutionalize. Charles V and Du Guesclin had shown that a professional, disciplined military commanded by competent men on rational principles could outperform England's contract armies over time. But both men were gone by 1380, and what came after them was not the continued development of these insights, but their abandonment, a return to the political chaos of competing princes, a mad king on the throne, and the same feudal impulses that had failed France so catastrophically at Crécy and Poitiers. The lesson of the Caroline phase would have to be learned again, at enormous cost, a generation later. What Du Guesclin's career proved, above all else, was the central argument of the entire war, that England's tactical superiority in battle was real and devastating, but also irrelevant over the long term if France refused to fight on those terms. The longbow was lethal in the battles it was allowed to fight. Du Guesclin's achievement was ensuring that it fought as few of those battles as possible, and that the hundreds of smaller, unglamorous engagements that determined who held which castle and which garrison on which river bend went, quietly and relentlessly, to France. It was not a heroic strategy. French chroniclers of the time often wrote about it with a kind of embarrassment. Their culture valued the cavalry charge, the personal duel, the glorious defeat over the ignominious survival. Du Guesclin himself was celebrated partly because his personal courage was beyond question, which gave the nobles a way to admire the strategy without quite confronting what it meant. But what it meant was this: England won battles, France won the war. And the difference between the two lay not in courage, but in who was willing to think clearly about what winning actually required. In the autumn of 1366, the Black Prince made a decision that military historians still argue about. He marched his army over the Pyrenees in winter, not to fight France, not to recover Aquitaine, but to restore a deposed Iberian king to his throne. The king in question was Pedro of Castile, who had fled his kingdom after his illegitimate half-brother Henry of Trastamara seized the throne with French backing and the military command of Bertrand du Guesclin. Pedro came to Bordeaux asking for help. The Black Prince gave it, advancing the costs of the entire expedition from his own treasury against Pedro's promise of future repayment. The campaign was, by every tactical measure, a masterpiece. At Niagara, on the 3rd of April 1367, the Black Prince's Anglo-Gascon army met Henry's Franco-Castilian force on open ground near the town. The Castilian cavalry broke early under longbow fire. Du Guesclin, commanding the professional French contingent in the center, fought with characteristic stubbornness but was eventually surrounded and captured. Henry himself escaped across the river, barely. His army was destroyed. Pedro was restored to his throne. The Black Prince spent the night on the battlefield, in the traditional manner of a victor, demonstrating his claim to the ground. After the battle, he asked whether Henry had been killed or captured. When he was told neither, that Henry had escaped, the prince replied in his Gascon dialect, "Nothing then is done." He was right. Not because Henry escaped, though that was damaging enough. He was right because every consequence of Niagara that mattered went against England, and all of them were already becoming visible before the army had finished its return march over the Pyrenees. Pedro was unable, or unwilling, to pay what he owed. The enormous sums the Black Prince had advanced to fund the campaign, the wages of his soldiers, the costs of the march itself. Pedro acknowledged the debt and did nothing about it. He resumed his throne and continued his habitual cruelties, alienating one Castilian noble after another, until the pool of men still loyal to him shrank to almost nothing. Within 2 years he was defeated, captured, and killed by Henry's own hand in a military encampment, precisely as Du Guesclin had arranged. Henry II of Castile then ruled the kingdom, paid France for its help, and provided the French navy with Castilian ships. The Black Prince returned to Aquitaine, having spent money he did not have, led an army whose best soldiers had been killed or taken ill in the Castilian summer, and achieved a tactical victory whose only lasting strategic consequence was to hand France a naval ally it would use to devastating effect. His own health had broken on the campaign. He contracted what was probably dysentery in the harsh conditions of the Castilian plateau, and he never fully recovered. The man who had been the finest field commander in Europe at 30 spent the years after Niagara in increasing physical deterioration, increasingly unable to ride or command. The financial ruin was immediate and irreversible. With Pedro refusing to pay, the Black Prince needed money. He turned to his Gascon subjects. In 1368, he imposed a hearth tax, a levy on every household in Aquitaine, to recover what the Castilian campaign had cost. Gascony had been loyal English territory for 2 centuries. Its nobility and merchants had prospered under English rule, had fought for English kings, had considered themselves distinct from France and allied to England by mutual interest. The hearth tax changed the calculation. The great lords of Aquitaine appealed to Charles V of France, claiming he remained their ultimate overlord. Charles accepted the appeal with no hesitation. It was the pretext he had been waiting for. What followed was the Caroline phase of the war, du Guesclin's systematic demolition of everything the Edwardian phase had built. But the deeper damage done by the Iberian sideshow was human and structural, not merely financial. The Black Prince, the military genius England needed to counter what was coming, had been removed from effective command by his own body. He returned to England in 1371, resigned the Principality of Aquitaine in 1372, and spent his final years in pain, politically active but physically incapable. He died on the 8th of June, 1376, aged 45. England's greatest soldier had been broken by a campaign fought for an ally who never paid. And then, the sea turned against England. In June 1372, a Castilian fleet under the Admiral Ambrosio Boccanegra intercepted an English convoy off the coast of La Rochelle. The English fleet was carrying the new governor of Aquitaine, the Earl of Pembroke, and £12,000 to pay the troops garrisoning the duchy, months of wages in a single cargo. Boccanegra waited at low tide when the English vessels were effectively stranded in the shallows, then attacked with incendiary weapons that turned the English decks into an inferno before the ships could maneuver. The English flagship was lost. Much of the fleet was destroyed or captured. Pembroke was taken prisoner. The £12,000 went to the bottom or into Castilian hands. The naval supremacy England had held since the Battle of Sluys in 1340 was gone. La Rochelle surrendered to du Guesclin weeks later. The garrison towns of Poitiers, Saintonge, and Angoumois fell in rapid succession as the English, stripped of naval resupply and without the funds to pay their garrisons, could not defend them. The Castilian fleet then turned its attention to the English Channel itself, raiding the Isle of Wight, burning Rye, attacking Portsmouth, Hastings, and Plymouth across the following years. For the first time since the war began, England was the country being raided from the sea. All of it traced back to one winter march over the Pyrenees and a Castilian king who never paid his debts. By the mid-1370s, the map of English France had been nearly erased. The vast territories won at Bretigny, Poitou, the Limousin, Saintonge, Périgord, Crécy, had been recovered by French forces under du Guesclin, one fortress at a time. Through a decade of patient siege work and strategic harassment, English Aquitaine had shrunk back to the narrow coastal strip around Bordeaux and Bayonne that England had held before the war began. Calais remained. That was almost all. 3 decades of military victories, ransoms, and chevauchés had produced a net territorial outcome barely distinguishable from the position in 1337. The English responded to du Guesclin's attritional strategy the only way they knew: more chevauchés. In 1373, John of Gaunt led approximately 10,000 men out of Calais on what became known as the Great Chevauchée, a march that covered over 900 miles through Picardy, Champagne, Burgundy, and Auvergne, before reaching Bordeaux in December. Charles V issued strict orders. French troops were to shadow the English columns and harass them, but never give them the pitched battle they were looking for. Farmers were to carry their goods behind city walls. The countryside was to be stripped of everything useful before the English arrived. Gaunt's army marched through a landscape emptied of food, shadowed by French cavalry that killed their stragglers and destroyed their foraging parties. The late autumn weather killed those disease had not yet taken. By the time the survivors reached Gascony, perhaps half the original force was gone, not from a single catastrophic defeat, but from months of accumulated attrition on a march that had burned everything it found and achieved nothing. It was arguably the final proof that the chevauchée, as a decisive strategic instrument, had run its course. France had learned to let the English exhaust themselves. Edward III saw almost none of this clearly. He was old, sinking into dementia by his final years, his court dominated by his mistress Alice Perrers and his son John of Gaunt, whose grip on power was widely resented. The brilliant king, who had designed the system at Crécy, was still formally on the throne as his life's work disintegrated around him. The Good Parliament of 1376, so named because it was the first to elect a speaker representing the commons, assembled to voice precisely the accumulated grievances of a kingdom that had spent 40 years paying for a war it was now watching collapse. Alice Perrers was banished from court. Gaunt's allies were impeached. It accomplished almost nothing of permanence. Before the Parliament had finished its work, the Black Prince died. The news arrived at Westminster on the 8th of June, 1376. He was 45. His body was taken to Canterbury Cathedral, where he had asked to be buried, and interred beneath a magnificent effigy with his black helmet, shield, and gauntlets hung above the tomb. Around the effigy, at his instruction, a French verse was inscribed, a meditation on mortality addressed to whoever passed, such as, "Thou art, once was I. Such as I am, thou too shalt be." The greatest English soldier of the age had been warning against pride since before his death. Edward III followed him by a year, dying on the 21st of June, 1377. He had reigned for 50 years. Contemporary chroniclers who had praised him in the glorious years of Crécy and Calais struggled to account for the last decade, the territories lost, the naval defeat, the financial exhaustion, the domestic political crisis. The kingdom that passed to his 10-year-old grandson Richard II was one that had spent itself across 3 generations and had almost nothing on the continent to show for it. The summer raiding fleets of the Franco-Castilian alliance were already burning English coastal towns as the old king lay dying. The war did not formally stop. France and England remained technically at war through Richard II's minority and into his personal rule. The French made raids on Rye, Plymouth, and other southern ports. The English launched ineffectual counter-expeditions. Both kingdoms were financially drained and politically unstable. The long truce eventually agreed at Lurlingham in 1389. Under 2 young kings, Richard II of England and the newly mad Charles VI of France, was less a peace than an exhausted mutual pause, a recognition that neither side had the means to prosecute the war with any effect. What the end of the Caroline phase revealed in retrospect was the central architectural problem of the English war effort that had been present from the beginning, but now impossible to ignore. England had built a military system designed to win battles. It had won battles, repeatedly, gloriously, against enormous odds. It had won battles at Crécy and Poitiers and Nájera. It had taken a French king prisoner, ridden to the walls of Paris, and signed a treaty giving it more French territory than any English king had held since the Plantagenet Empire of the 12th century. And it had lost it all, not by losing a battle, but because holding territory required permanent garrisons, permanent funding, and permanent political will, and England had none of these things on a reliable institutional basis. France, for all its military failures, was still France. Its population was larger. Its tax base, however damaged, was larger. Its territory provided the resources to sustain a long war in ways that an island kingdom fighting 3,000 miles from home simply could not match over time. The chevauchée could ruin a province for a decade. It could not ruin a kingdom permanently. Du Guesclin had understood this. Charles V had built a strategy around it. And when those two men died within 2 months of each other in the autumn of 1380, they left behind a France that was battered, exhausted, and in the hands of an 11-year-old king's squabbling uncles. But it was still there. England's great victories had left no permanent mark on the ground at all. The quarter-century between the death of Edward III and the reopening of war under Henry V was not a quiet interlude. It was the period in which both kingdoms came closest to destroying themselves from within, and in which the structural weaknesses that had been accumulating beneath the surface of both states finally broke through. What made it remarkable was the synchronicity. England and France did not take turns in crisis. They collapsed at the same time, each unable to exploit the other's weakness because each was too consumed by its own. England's crisis began almost immediately after Edward III died. His grandson Richard II inherited the throne at 10 years old, and a kingdom already seething with grievances the old king had never addressed. The Peasants' revolt came in the summer of 1381. The trigger was a third poll tax, a flat levy on every head regardless of wealth. And when officials began enforcing it in Kent and Essex, the countryside erupted. Tens of thousands of men marched on London under Wat Tyler, burned the Savoy Palace of John of Gaunt, murdered officials and foreigners, and stormed the Tower of London. Richard rode out to meet them at Smithfield at 14 years old. Tyler was killed in the confrontation. Richard promised reforms he had no intention of honoring. The Rising collapsed, its leaders were executed, and nothing fundamental changed, except that Parliament grew permanently warier of taxation, and England's capacity to fund the war in France narrowed still further. Richard grew into a king who was genuinely intelligent and intermittently capable, but constitutionally unsuited to the requirements of medieval monarchy. He resented the constraints his nobles placed on him, cultivated favorites at the expense of the great magnates, and eventually descended into a governance style that contemporaries described without hesitation as tyranny. When his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt, heir to the vast Duchy of Lancaster, returned from exile in 1399 to reclaim his confiscated inheritance, Richard's own nobles simply did not defend him. Almost no one came. Richard was captured in Wales, forced to abdicate in the Tower of London in September, and dead in Pontefract Castle within months. He was 33. Henry Bolingbroke became Henry IV, the first king of the House of Lancaster, and immediately discovered what the crown actually weighed. Rebellions arrived almost before he had finished his coronation. In Wales, Owain Glyndwr, a Welsh lord with legitimate grievances and impeccable lineage, declared himself Prince of Wales in 1400 and launched what became the last serious war of Welsh independence. For years, Glyndwr controlled most of the country, formed alliances with Scotland and France, held a parliament at Machynlleth, and humiliated English armies sent against him. In the north, Henry Percy, known as Hotspur, son of the Earl of Northumberland and one of the most capable soldiers in England, turned against Henry IV and was killed at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403. His father rebelled again in 1408. England was being consumed from every direction simultaneously. Henry IV spent most of his reign managing a kingdom that seemed to actively resist being governed. He suffered from chronic illness from at least 1407 onward, a combination of afflictions that progressively stripped him of the ability to function as a monarch. Governance increasingly fell to his son, Henry of Monmouth, who had already proven himself in Wales. The father who had seized a throne by force spent his final years surrendering effective power to the son who would use it so much more productively. Henry IV died in March 1413, worn out, hated by many, and having accomplished almost nothing in France beyond preserving the status quo. What he passed on to his son was a kingdom intact, but barely, a throne of questionable legitimacy, and an almost implacable determination in his heir to vindicate the Lancastrian claim in the most spectacular way possible. France, meanwhile, had collapsed into something that defied ordinary political description. In 1392, King Charles VI, the young man who had begun his personal rule with real promise, suffered a catastrophic mental crisis while riding through a forest near Le Mans. Several of his knights fell before his attendants could bring him under control. The episodes of madness returned, grew longer, grew more severe. In his worst episodes, his grip on reality dissolved entirely. In one recurring delusion, he believed his own body was too fragile to bear human contact. For the next 30 years, France was ruled by a man who had no reliable grip on reality, and every powerful faction in the kingdom moved to fill the vacuum. The struggle that emerged was between two great houses, the Armagnacs, whose power base was the Orléans line, and the Burgundians, led by John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, who controlled the wealthiest territory in France and the most strategically vital, including Flanders with its English wool trade. The two factions recruited armies, fought battles, occupied Paris, and massacred each other's supporters in the capital's streets. In 1407, John the Fearless had his cousin Louis of Orléans, the king's brother, dragged from his mule on a Paris street and cut down by assassins. The civil war that followed consumed every resource France might otherwise have directed against England. Thousands of French fighting men spent the next decade killing other Frenchmen. The figure who would eventually thread his way through all of this was the Dauphin Charles, the future Charles VII, a shy, physically unimpressive young man whose legitimacy was questioned even by his own mother. His father was mad, his kingdom was at war with itself, and the two great factions contesting power were competing to either use him or destroy him. When John the Fearless was killed on the bridge at Montereau in September 1419, cut down by the Dauphin's own men during a supposedly reconciliatory meeting, the political consequences were catastrophic. John's son, Philip the Good, swore revenge and immediately allied himself with England. France's most powerful duke was now England's most powerful ally. The wheel of fortune that had turned so dramatically in 1360, England at the summit, France nearly destroyed, had completed another full rotation. Both kingdoms had spent the interval largely dismantling themselves. England had deposed one king, barely survived multiple rebellions, and handed power to a usurper whose legitimacy was permanently contested. France had a mad king, a kingdom split by civil war, and its most powerful noblemen allied with the enemy. The stage was set for the most dramatic single act of the entire war. A new English king was ready, and France had almost nothing left with which to stop him. Henry V came to the throne on the 20th of March, 1413, as a snowstorm raged outside Westminster Abbey. He was 25. He had spent his adolescence in Wales, learning to fight, learning to govern, and, by his own account and the accounts of everyone who had watched him, learning to be a king. The transformation from the wayward Prince Hal of popular legend to the methodical, devout, and relentlessly purposeful Henry V was one of the most complete self-reinventions in English royal history. He had plans for France. He had been making them for years. Henry V's demands to France in late 1414 were so extreme that historians have debated ever since whether he intended them to be accepted or refused. He wanted the full implementation of the Treaty of Bretigny, which had given England Aquitaine in full sovereignty. He wanted Normandy, Maine, Anjou, and overlordship of Brittany. He wanted an additional £330,000 in outstanding ransom from the capture of Jean II, money France had never fully paid. He wanted to marry a French princess. The French offered territory and a large dowry, but fell far short of his demands. Henry had his pretext. He began raising the largest English army assembled since Crécy. He landed at the mouth of the Seine on the 13th of August, 1415, with roughly 12,000 men. His first objective was the fortified port of Harfleur, which he needed as a channel base. The garrison held out for 5 weeks. Henry bombarded the walls, dug mines, built counter-fortifications, and eventually forced surrender on the 22nd of September. But the siege had cost him dearly. Dysentery tore through his army during the weeks before Harfleur fell. By the time the garrison capitulated, Henry's force had been cut almost in half by disease. With the campaigning season nearly over, he made the decision that defined his reputation. Rather than sail home, he would march across France to Calais through hostile territory with roughly 6,000 men. The French intercepted him near the village of Agincourt on the 25th of October, 1415, the feast day of Saint Crispin. It was Crécy again, and Poitiers again, and every English victory of the past 70 years compressed into a single afternoon. The battlefield was a freshly plowed field between 2 areas of woodland, sodden with a week of rain, narrowing to a front that prevented the French from using their numerical advantage. Henry moved his archers within range and began loosing. The French knights, in full plate armor, advanced through knee-deep mud. The arrows fell on them in sheets. Those who reached the English line were so exhausted by the approach that dismounted English soldiers killed them where they stood or fell. The French lost somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 men at Agincourt. 3 dukes were killed. 9 counts were killed. The English dead numbered in the hundreds. Among the prisoners were the Duke of Orléans, who would spend 25 years in comfortable captivity in England, and the Marshal of France. For the second time in 60 years, the English had effectively decapitated the French military aristocracy on a single afternoon. The English arrived in Calais to a welcome that was almost hysterical in its enthusiasm. When Henry returned to London in November, the procession laid on for him included choirs, tapestries, and elaborate tableaux staged along the route from Blackheath to the city. What followed Agincourt was something altogether different from any English campaign before it. Henry was not simply raiding, he was conquering. In the summer of 1417, he returned to France with another army and began the systematic reduction of Normandy. Town by town, castle by castle, Caen fell quickly, then Bayeux, then fortress after fortress through the countryside. Rouen, the Norman capital, was besieged from July 1418 until January 1419. Henry sealed it completely, refusing to let the civilian population expelled from the city pass through his lines. Those turned away from both sides perished in the ground between the walls and the English encampment while he waited. Rouen surrendered in January 1419. Normandy was English for the first time in 2 centuries. The political assassination of John the Fearless on the bridge at Montereau in September 1419 handed Henry everything else. When the Armagnac men cut down the Duke of Burgundy during what was supposed to be a reconciliation meeting, Philip the Good, John's son and heir, was consumed by a grief and rage that overrode every other political calculation. He formed an alliance with England. He recognized Henry's claim to the French throne. A monk who showed Francis I the mutilated skull of John the Fearless a century later reportedly said, "This is the hole through which the English entered France." It was not an exaggeration. The Treaty of Troyes was signed on the 21st of May, 1420. Charles VI, in one of his periods of relative lucidity, set his seal to a document that disinherited his own son, declaring the Dauphin illegitimate, and named Henry V heir and regent of France. Henry married Catherine of Valois, Charles's daughter, at Troyes Cathedral 2 weeks later. Their son would inherit both kingdoms. England and France, after 80 years of war, were to be united under a single crown. All of Paris was under Anglo-Burgundian control. More than half of France had submitted to the new order. The Dauphin, driven to the south of the Loire with his rump court and his disputed legitimacy, seemed to be waiting only for the formality of his own defeat. Henry spent his remaining years governing both kingdoms simultaneously, campaigning in France each summer and returning to England to manage his parliament and treasury in between. He was by every account a man of extraordinary energy, administrative precision, and absolute conviction in the righteousness of his cause. He could compose music, read Latin, manage complex diplomatic negotiations, and command an army in the field, often while suffering from illness. He showed no signs of letting the dual monarchy slide into the lethargy that had consumed Edward III. The men around him were in no doubt that if anyone could make the union real, it was this king. He did not get the time. In the summer of 1422, Henry fell ill while on campaign at the siege of Meaux. He refused to leave his army, insisting on remaining in the field even as his condition worsened. By August, he was dying. He was brought to the castle of Vincennes, where he died on the 31st of August, 1422, aged 35. His son, also named Henry, was 9 months old. 2 months later, Charles VI of France died as well, the mad king outlasting the conqueror by barely an autumn. Under the terms of the Treaty of Troyes, the dual monarchy now rested on an infant. The question of what Henry V might have achieved had he lived another decade is one that historians cannot answer, but cannot stop asking. He had come closer than any English king before or since to the thing Edward III had claimed in 1340, and every Plantagenet had pursued through 4 generations of war. He had France's greatest duke as his ally, France's capital under his control, and France's crown formally promised to his bloodline. What he had not done, and what no amount of genius could have done in the time he was given, was build the institutional foundations, the French taxation, the French bureaucracy, the French military, that would allow his conquest to survive without him. That problem would define everything that followed. The man who was supposed to build those foundations was an infant in a cradle at Windsor. The regency fell to Henry's brother John, Duke of Bedford, capable, experienced, and genuinely committed to making the dual monarchy work. Around Bedford, the competing interests of English nobles and French factions ground against each other constantly. The Dauphin, whom the Treaty of Troyes had declared illegitimate, retreated to the south of the Loire with his rump court, his disputed claim, and a France that was too exhausted to fight but too proud to fully surrender. He was not yet Charles VII. He was not yet much of anything. But he was still there, and that in the end was what mattered. Henry V had built the most complete English position in France since the Norman conquest. He had done it in 7 years, through a combination of battlefield genius, diplomatic ruthlessness, and personal force of will that no English king before or since could match. What he had not built, because no one could build it in 7 years, was a France that accepted its own subjugation. The dual monarchy existed on paper and at sword point. Without the sword hand that had created it, it would have to be maintained by lesser men against a people who had not yet decided to stop. John, Duke of Bedford, was the man Henry V had trusted most. He was 33 when his brother died, experienced, methodical, and genuinely capable, probably the only person in England who understood the full weight of what had been built in France and what it would take to maintain it. On the 1st of September 1422, Bedford became regent of France in the name of an infant who had not yet learned to walk. What he inherited was not a settled conquest. It was a set of obligations strung across hundreds of miles of hostile or uncertain territory, held together by the personal authority of a king who was 9 months old. Bedford did everything right, and it was still not enough. He sealed the Burgundian alliance by marrying Philip the Good's sister Anne in May 1423. A match that was reportedly a genuine love affair, a rarity in medieval political marriages. He won the Battle of Verneuil in August 1424, a victory so complete that French chroniclers called it a second Agincourt. The Scots, who had come to reinforce Charles's forces, were virtually annihilated, and Bedford temporarily removed any serious threat to English Normandy from the south. He governed the occupied territories with a discipline and administrative care that Henry V himself would have recognized. For 7 years after Henry's death, the dual monarchy functioned. The structural problem was one no administrator could solve. The dual monarchy depended on 3 things held simultaneously: English military resources sufficient to garrison France, Burgundian political support sufficient to legitimize the occupation, and a French population willing to accept, or at least tolerate, the arrangement. All 3 were present in 1422, and all 3 were eroding by 1429. England's Parliament grew more reluctant with each passing year to fund a war whose costs were rising and whose benefits were invisible to English taxpayers. The Burgundians, having avenged John the Fearless and secured their territorial interests, had less and less reason to continue bleeding for English ambitions. And the French in the occupied territories had not forgotten who they were. While Bedford managed the impossible in the north, Charles VII, still nominally the Dauphin in the eyes of the Treaty of Troyes, king only in his own court's estimation, governed what remained of unoccupied France from beyond the Loire. His court at Chinon was not magnificent. His finances were constrained, his military capacity was limited, and his legitimacy was contested even by those closest to him. His own mother had publicly declared him illegitimate, a claim almost certainly false, but damaging regardless. The English called him the King of Bourges after the modest city where he sometimes held court. They meant it as an insult. He wore it like a wound he had not yet decided how to treat. The war of attrition ground on. Bedford launched the siege of Orleans in the autumn of 1428, a strategic move his most experienced commanders advised against, for the city was large, the garrison determined, and the English forces insufficient to seal it completely. The Earl of Salisbury, who had planned the operation, was mortally struck by a cannonball fragment within days of the siege beginning. His replacement, the Earl of Suffolk, settled in for a long blockade. By the winter of 1428 to 1429, Orleans had been holding out for months, and Charles VII had begun to consider whether his kingdom south of the Loire was all he would ever have. The city was the key to the Loire Valley. If Orleans fell, the road to the rest of Charles's territory lay open. Bedford himself had become the pivot on which the entire enterprise turned. When he was in France, the occupation functioned. When he was drawn back to England, as he was repeatedly, to manage the incessant political quarrels between his brother Gloucester and Cardinal Beaufort over control of the Regency Council, French territory eroded in his absence. The fundamental problem was that England in 1430 was not the England of 1415. The enthusiasm generated by Agincourt had been spent. Parliament would fund specific campaigns grudgingly and balked at the permanent taxation that sustaining an occupation across hundreds of French garrisons actually required. Every year, the gap between what the occupation needed and what England was willing to provide grew wider. In December 1431, Bedford arranged for the 10-year-old Henry VI to be crowned King of France in Paris at Notre Dame Cathedral. It was the correct political move, a coronation in the traditional Royal Church of France, establishing the infant's claim in the most visible possible way. It was also the clearest possible sign of how far the dual monarchy had drifted from its original premises. Charles VII had been crowned at Reims 2 years earlier in the ancient cathedral where French kings had received their sacred oil for centuries. Henry VI was crowned in Paris by an English cardinal before a French population that watched in ambivalent silence. Both kings were crowned. Only one coronation had the sacred geography of French kingship behind it. The alliance that held the whole edifice together finally broke in the summer of 1435. Bedford's first wife, Anne of Burgundy, had died in 1432. He remarried, a diplomatic miscalculation that offended Philip the Good, who had not been consulted. At the Congress of Reims in August and September 1435, negotiators from England, France, and Burgundy gathered to discuss terms. The English delegation refused to yield any substantial ground on the French crown. Philip of Burgundy, watching his options clearly, chose France. On the 14th of September 1435, Bedford died at Rouen. The man who had been holding the entire English position in France together by force of personality and competence was gone. 6 days later, the Treaty of Arras was signed. Philip the Good formally recognized Charles VII as King of France. Paris fell to French forces the following spring. What remained of English France after 1435 was a diminished, fragile thing, kept alive more by inertia and stubbornness than by any coherent strategy. English garrisons held Normandy and the Gascon coast, but the great rationale of the dual monarchy, that England and France would be united under a single Valois-Lancastrian line, had effectively died with Bedford. What came after was a slow retreat that the English court, divided and increasingly dysfunctional under the growing shadow of Henry VI's inadequacy, lacked the will or the resources to halt. She was born around 1412 in the village of Domremy, in the Duchy of Bar on the eastern border of France, a farming village that had been raided by both English and Burgundian forces in her childhood. Her father leased land. Her mother raised her in a piety that was typical of the rural French poor, intense, personal, and built around the saints. By her own account, she began hearing voices around the age of 13. She identified them as Saint Michael, Saint Margaret, and Saint Catherine. By the time she was 16, the voices had given her a specific instruction. She was to go to the Dauphin Charles and save France. To understand why anyone listened to her, you have to understand the state of France in the winter of 1428 to 1429. Orléans had been under English siege for months. Charles VII sat at Chinon, demoralized to the point of near paralysis, reportedly contemplating withdrawing entirely beyond the Loire or even to Scotland. The commanders who had fought for France for years were exhausted and losing faith in their cause. The population of occupied France had lived under Anglo-Burgundian control long enough that many had begun to accommodate themselves to it. The kingdom that Jean II had ruled, however badly, and that Charles V had rebuilt, was reduced to a rump south of a river, governed by a king whose own mother had called him illegitimate. Joan made the journey from Domremy to Chinon in February 1429, 11 days on horseback through territory controlled by forces that would have imprisoned or killed her. She arrived at court and asked to speak to Charles. The king, reportedly, disguised himself among his courtiers to test her, and she found him anyway. She told him he was the true king of France, that she had been sent by God to lift the siege of Orléans and see him crowned at Reims. Charles sent her to Poitiers, where a council of theologians examined her for 3 weeks. They found no evidence of heresy or deception. She was sent to Tours for armor and horses. She was given command of a relief force. What happened next at Orléans confounded everything the English expected. Joan arrived on the 29th of April, 1429, entering the city through its eastern gate, while a French diversionary attack held English attention on the west side. The effect on the garrison's morale was immediate and visible. Soldiers who had been conducting a passive defense for months began to sortie aggressively. On the 7th of May, French forces stormed the Tourelle, the great fortified gatehouse controlling the bridge over the Loire, in a frontal assault that had been repulsed before and succeeded now. Joan was struck by a crossbow bolt during the assault and fell back from the fighting. She had the wound tended by her own hand by most accounts and returned before the day was decided. The Tourelle fell that evening. The next morning, the English abandoned their siege lines and withdrew. The relief of Orléans took 9 days. It had lasted 210 days. The strategic effect was enormous, but the political effect was in some ways larger. The English had built their occupation of France on a foundation of demonstrated military superiority. The idea, reinforced at Crécy and Poitiers and Agincourt, that English arms were simply better than French arms, and that resistance was ultimately futile. Joan had shattered that idea in front of every garrison, every occupied city, and every French peasant who heard the news. The English had been forced from their siege lines by a 17-year-old girl they had never heard of a month before. Whatever her voices were, the effect was real. The Loire campaign that followed moved with a speed that disordered English planning entirely. Jargeau fell on the 12th of June, Beaugency on the 16th. At Poitiers on the 18th, French cavalry caught the English longbowmen before they had set their defensive stakes and drove straight through them. The English lost somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 men. John Talbot, the most feared English commander in France, a man whose very name had been used to frighten French children into obedience, was captured. The invincibility of the English longbow had been based in part on its being allowed to choose its ground and prepare its position. At Poitiers, it was given neither. The myth broke with it. Joan pressed the advantage in the only way that mattered. She insisted that Charles march to Reims immediately for his coronation, not later, not when it was safer, but now, while the momentum held. The commanders around her argued for consolidation, for securing the Loire towns first, for caution. Joan overruled them with a persistence that bordered on insubordination. Charles, for once in his cautious life, agreed. The army left Guyenne on the 29th of June, 1429, and marched through territory held by the Burgundians. Town after town opened its gates without a fight. On the 17th of July, 1429, in the great Gothic cathedral at Reims, the same cathedral where Louis the Pious had been crowned, where the sacred oil descended from heaven in the theology of French kingship, Charles VII received his coronation. Joan stood beside him, holding her banner. The coronation was not militarily decisive. It did not take back a single additional acre of English-held territory that week. What it did was far more important over time. Charles VII was now, incontestably, the anointed king of France in the place where French kings had been anointed since the age of Charlemagne. The claim that the Treaty of Troyes had legitimate French backing, that a French king had freely given his throne to an English line, became harder to sustain the moment a rival claimant had received the sacred oil at Reims. Bedford understood this immediately. His response was to arrange Henry VI's own French coronation in Paris 2 years later. It was the right strategic response. It was also, implicitly, an admission that the coronation at Reims had forced his hand. Joan's trajectory from that summer onward followed a different logic, less military, more political, and ultimately fatal. She failed to take Paris in September 1429, repulsed from the walls in an assault that Charles had authorized only reluctantly. She continued campaigning through the autumn and winter, increasingly without the full support of Charles's court, where her usefulness was being weighed against the complications she caused. At Compiègne, on the 23rd of May, 1430, she was captured by Burgundian forces during a sortie outside the town walls. Charles VII made no serious effort to ransom or rescue her. The Burgundians sold her to the English. Bedford had her tried in Rouen by an ecclesiastical court under Bishop Pierre Cochon, a man whose political alignment with the English was not subtle. The charge was heresy. The real purpose was to establish for the record and for the populations of occupied France that Joan's voices were diabolic and her mission a fraud, and therefore that the coronation at Reims, which they had enabled, carried no divine sanction. Joan defended herself before the court with a clarity and intelligence that visibly disconcerted her interrogators. She was convicted, briefly recanted under duress, then withdrew her recantation. On the 30th of May, 1431, Joan of Arc was executed in the old market square of Rouen. She was 19 years old. An English soldier who witnessed the sentence carried out reportedly said afterwards that they had put a saint to death. 25 years later, a papal inquiry formally annulled her conviction and declared the trial fraudulent. In 1456, she was posthumously declared innocent. She was canonized in 1920. What she had actually changed, stripped of legend and looked at plainly, was this. She had given Charles VII his coronation at the moment when he most needed it and least deserved it. She had broken the psychological foundation of English occupation. She had proved at Orléans and Poitiers that French armies could defeat English armies in the field under the right conditions. And she had done all of this before she was old enough by English reckoning to be considered an adult. The France that emerged on the other side of 1431 was not the France she had found. It was harder, angrier, and beginning slowly to understand what it needed to do. Charles VII had been watching England fight France for 30 years before he was old enough to do anything about it. He had watched his father surrender sovereignty over the kingdom in a treaty. He had watched Bedford administer the occupied North with a competence that made resistance feel futile. He had watched Joan of Arc hand him his coronation and then watched his court fail to ransom her. By the time the Truce of Tours was signed in 1444, he had learned something England had never fully grasped, that winning battles was not the same as winning a war, and that wars were won by the side that could sustain its military effort across years and decades without depending on the outcome of any single engagement. The transformation he oversaw in the 1440s was the most consequential institutional change in French history since the Capetian dynasty had begun centralizing royal power 2 centuries earlier. It did not happen all at once, and it was not driven by a single dramatic decision. It was a series of interlocking reforms that each made the others more effective. A new tax that paid for a new army that required new weapons that required new administrators, and new administrators who gradually extended royal authority into corners of France where it had never reliably reached before. The fiscal foundations came first. For most of the war's history, the French crown had funded military campaigns through emergency levies, extraordinary grants from the Estates General that required negotiation and compromise every time they were needed, and that gave the nobility leverage over royal policy in return. Charles changed this. Through a series of ordinances beginning in 1439, he extended the taille, a direct tax on land, from a temporary emergency measure to a permanent feature of royal finance. By the mid-1440s, the taille was generating revenues that the crown controlled entirely, without needing to bargain for them annually. Royal income increased by roughly 1.8 million crowns. For the first time in the war's history, France had a treasury that could actually fund the cost of continuous military operations. The money paid for soldiers who did not go home. Before the reforms of the 1440s, French armies functioned on the medieval principle. Lords summoned their retinues. Mercenary contracts were negotiated for specific campaigns, and at the end of the fighting season, the men dispersed. Free companies formed from the remnants and pillaged what remained. The cycle had been repeating, with devastating consequences for the French countryside since the Black Death. Charles broke it. In January 1445, the royal government formally announced the creation of the Compagnie d'Ordonnance, standing units of professional cavalry, paid monthly from royal revenues, stationed across the kingdom in peacetime, answerable to the crown rather than to any feudal lord. By 1445, France had 15 companies, comprising roughly 9,000 men. They were not simply a larger version of the old feudal levy. They were a qualitatively different kind of military organization. Each company was commanded by a captain, appointed by the king, not by a great noble exercising inherited right. Each soldier was paid on a regular salary, which meant their loyalty ran to the institution that paid them, rather than to the regional power that had previously recruited them. Discipline could be enforced. Standards could be set and maintained. When a campaign ended, the soldiers did not disperse into banditry. They returned to their garrison towns and waited for the next campaign, still paid, still part of the royal military. The mercenaries who refused to join were hunted down. This was not a minor administrative matter. The accoucheurs, the routiers of the 1440s, had been terrorizing the French countryside for years, doing to French villages what English chevauchés had done to them a generation earlier. Charles used his new standing companies to systematically destroy the bands that would not submit. Some of the most experienced fighters in France were given a choice: serve the crown on regular wages or be treated as criminals. Most chose wages. The countryside gradually quietened in ways it had not been quiet since before Crécy. Into this reformed military structure, the Bureau brothers fitted like a key into a lock. Jean Bureau, a Parisian merchant's son, who had trained as a lawyer during Bedford's occupation of the capital, offered his services to Charles VII in 1434. His brother Gaspard followed. Both were what their age lacked and desperately needed, men who understood artillery not as a supplement to conventional warfare, but as its decisive arm. Jean was appointed master gunner of the French artillery by royal letters in 1439. Gaspard became Grand Master of the King's artillery in 1444. Both were ennobled in 1447. Sons of a merchant, raised to the nobility by their expertise with cannon. What the Bureau brothers built was a rationalized, professionalized artillery system unlike anything in Europe. The haphazard collection of guns that French armies had previously deployed, varying in caliber, quality, and reliability, operated by artisans of variable skill, was replaced by a standardized arsenal. Calibers were unified so that a single type of shot could supply multiple guns. The material shifted from wrought iron to cast iron barrels, which were stronger and less likely to fail catastrophically. Gunpowder was improved through a process that produced a more potent, more consistent compound that did not need to be remixed in the field. The result was an artillery system that could fire faster, more reliably, and at greater range than anything England possessed. The tactical implication was profound. Every English castle, every English garrison town in France had been built for a pre-artillery world. Their high walls were designed to resist infantry assault and conventional siege equipment. Against Bureau's bombards, those walls became liabilities. A fortification that could hold out against a medieval siege for months could be reduced in days by concentrated cannon fire. The Bureau brothers exploited this systematically, establishing arsenals and supply depots before each campaign, calculating which walls were oldest and most vulnerable, positioning their guns with the methodical precision of men who thought in terms of engineering rather than honor. Castle after castle, town after town, surrendered before the bombardments ended or shortly after. The Truce of Tours had given Charles the years he needed. When it expired in 1449 and English held Normandy provided the pretext, a breach of the peace by an English captain at Fougères, the reformed French army moved into action against an English occupation that had not undergone any equivalent transformation. England was still fighting with the same contract army system, the same tactical assumptions, the same institutional framework it had deployed at Agincourt. France was fighting with something genuinely new. The outcome was not a contest. It was a demonstration of what happens when a state that has rebuilt itself faces a state that has not. The Compagnie d'Ordonnance, the Permanent Tie, and the Bureau Brothers artillery did not simply win the final campaigns of the 100 Years' War. They created the institutional template for the French state and the French military for the next 2 centuries. Charles's son, Louis XI, would use the same standing army to suppress his own nobility. Charles VIII would lead it into Italy in 1494, beginning the Italian Wars. The administrative machinery the Bureau Brothers had developed to manage the artillery, procurement, standardization, logistics, oversight, became the model for royal administration more broadly. Their word entered the language. The French gave the world its standing armies. They also gave it, rather less glamorously, its bureaucracy. None of this was visible to England in the late 1440s. What was visible was that French armies were suddenly winning battles they would previously have lost, taking fortresses they would previously have besieged for months and advancing across Normandy and Gascony at a pace that English garrisons, underfunded and understrength, could not match. England had spent the entire war believing that the question of who would ultimately prevail was a question about battles. France, under Charles VII, had finally understood that the question was about states. When the Truce of Tours expired and Charles VII launched his reconquest of Normandy in the summer of 1449, he did not do it with a single great army. He did it with 4 coordinated columns moving simultaneously from different directions, each accompanied by its artillery train, each assigned specific objectives that fed into a larger operational plan. The English had never faced anything like it. Their garrisons were scattered across hundreds of positions, each dependent on reinforcement from a central force that no longer existed in sufficient strength to send it. The French did not need to fight a single decisive battle. They needed only to keep moving, keep besieging, and let the Bureau Brothers' guns do what guns do to medieval walls. Rouen fell in October 1449. The city that Henry V had starved into submission over 7 months in 1418, the city whose garrison had expelled its own civilians sick and elderly rather than feed them, surrendered in less than a week once Bureau's artillery opened on its walls. The Duke of Somerset, commanding what remained of English Normandy, was allowed to march his garrison out to Caen. Harfleur fell in December. Honfleur in January 1450. Bayeux surrendered when the appearance of Bureau's bombards outside its walls was enough. The garrison judged the alternative and gave up without the bombardment beginning. Caen resisted for 3 weeks before Bureau's guns brought the bombardment into the heart of the town itself. The Duke surrendered immediately. Cherbourg was the last English stronghold in Normandy, and Jean Bureau handled it with a characteristic ingenuity that became famous. The town's seaward defenses were protected by tidal water. The guns could not easily reach them from the land side. Bureau solved this by positioning his heaviest artillery below the high water mark on the beach. At high tide, the guns were submerged. At low tide, when the water receded, they opened fire. The bombardment that followed, a French chronicler noted, was unlike anything previously witnessed in the history of siege warfare. Cherbourg surrendered on the 12th of August, 1450. All of Normandy was French for the first time in nearly 3.5 decades. There remained Gascony. The English had held the duchy for 3 centuries. Its population had prospered under English rule, supplied wine to English households for generations, and retained an identity that was genuinely distinct from the France that surrounded them. When Charles's army took Bordeaux in the summer of 1451, the Gascon population proved the depth of their attachment. They expelled the French garrison, sent envoys to London, and invited the English back. England, for once, responded. In October 1452, the 66-year-old John Talbot, the most feared English commander in France, the man whose name had been used to frighten French children, landed near Bordeaux with 3,000 men. Within weeks, he had retaken most of western Gascony. It was as if the war had run backwards by a generation. Charles VII had been taken by surprise. He spent the winter preparing his response. In the summer of 1453, 3 separate French armies invaded Gascony simultaneously from different directions. Talbot was waiting at Bordeaux, gathering strength, intending to meet the French on ground of his own choosing when the moment was right. He had been here before, outnumbered, surrounded by hostile territory, waiting for the right engagement. His record in exactly these situations was among the finest in the war. The French army besieging the town of Castillon, some 40 kilometers east of Bordeaux, sent urgently for relief on the 16th of July, 1453. Talbot rode through the night with his mounted vanguard, roughly 500 men-at-arms and 800 mounted archers. He reached Castillon before dawn. A scout reported that the French camp appeared to be in motion, dust clouds rising as horses and men moved in the morning light. Talbot read it as a retreat. He attacked immediately against the advice of his senior officers, refusing to wait for his infantry to come up, refusing to examine the French position before committing. The dust was from Jean Bureau's cavalry drivers taking their horses to safety behind the lines before the battle began. Bureau had constructed a fortified artillery park east of Castillon on the northern bank of the Dordogne. Earthen ramparts backed by timber palisades, 3 sides protected by ditches, the open northern flank screened by 1,000 Breton infantry at the village of Capitourlan. Inside the enclosure, approximately 300 guns of varying caliber were positioned along the southern rampart, facing the direction from which the English would come. They were not pointed at a castle wall. They were pointed across an open field at advancing infantry. This was field artillery in a form the medieval world had not previously encountered, deployed with the systematic logic of an engineer rather than the instincts of a knight. Talbot's cavalry crossed the river Lidoire and turned toward Bureau's enclosure without waiting for the main body of English infantry to come up. The guns opened fire at close range. Each shot reportedly killed multiple men. The vanguard advanced, took catastrophic casualties, and still pressed forward. It was Talbot's army, and Talbot's armies did not stop. His infantry arrived in pieces, fed into the assault in the sequence they reached the field, rather than in coordinated waves. Each contingent was destroyed in turn. For an hour, the English attacked one of the most lethal defensive positions ever constructed and refused to acknowledge the reality of what was happening to them. The Breton cavalry arrived from the north and hit Talbot's exposed right flank as the assault began to fragment. Bureau launched a counterattack from the enclosure simultaneously. The English line broke. Talbot, who had refused to wear armor because of a chivalric oath he had sworn to Charles VII after a previous capture, an oath never to bear arms against France, was the only man on the battlefield still mounted and unprotected when his horse went down beneath him. He did not rise again. His son, fighting at his side, fell in the same action. When Talbot's banner fell, what remained of the English army disintegrated toward the river. Castillon was over in roughly 2 hours. The English lost between 2,000 and 4,000 men. French losses were minimal. It was, in the most literal sense, the inverse of Crécy. cannon fire, doing to advancing infantry what English longbows had done to advancing cavalry 107 years before. The instrument of war had changed. The institutional infrastructure that made that instrument effective had changed. The kingdom that had the discipline and the resources to deploy that infrastructure had changed. England had changed almost nothing. Bordeaux surrendered on the 19th of October, 1453. With it went the last substantial English territory in France. Gascony, which had been in English hands since the marriage of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152, for 301 years, was French. Calais remained. That was all that was left of an empire that had once stretched from the Channel to the Pyrenees. Neither side formally declared the war over. No peace treaty was signed in 1453. The two kingdoms remained technically at war for another 22 years, until the Treaty of Picquigny in 1475, when Edward IV of England accepted a French pension and withdrew his army. But after the 19th of October 1453, there were no more battles. There was nothing left for England to fight for, and nothing left for France to reconquer. The guns had done their work. The medieval order they had blown apart would not be reassembled. England in the autumn of 1453 was a kingdom in shock. The loss of Gascony was not simply a military setback. It was the end of a 300-year connection between the English crown and continental Europe that had shaped everything from the wine on English tables to the identity of the English nobility. Within weeks of the news arriving from Bordeaux, Henry VI suffered a complete mental collapse, falling into a catatonic state from which he did not emerge for 17 months. Whether the catastrophe of France broke him, or whether a fragility already present finally gave way, is impossible to say. What is certain is that England lost its last major territory in France and its king's mind within the same season. The political structure Henry's collapse exposed had been under stress for years. The English court was split between factions centered on Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, who had presided over the final loss of Normandy and was widely blamed for it, and Richard, Duke of York, who had served in France, believed the war could have been managed better, and had a claim to the English throne that was, by certain reckonings of the Plantagenet succession, stronger than Henry's own. With Henry incapacitated, York assumed the protectorate. When Henry recovered, Somerset was released from the Tower and restored to favor. The collision was now unavoidable. At the First Battle of St. Albans in May 1455, Somerset was killed and the Wars of the Roses began. The war that had been fought in France had come home. The connection between the loss of France and the civil war that followed was not incidental. The English nobility had spent 3 generations investing in the French war, through campaigns, through ransoms, through the administrative apparatus of occupied territory. When those investments were wiped out by Charles VII's reconquest, the men who had made them came home with grievances, military skills, and private retinues that had no outlet except domestic politics. The nobles who had been disciplined by campaigns and contracts in France returned to an England whose institutions were not strong enough to manage them. Edward III had created great appanage duchies for his sons to fund the war effort. Those duchies had become the power bases from which the Civil War was fought. France's aftermath was the opposite. The institutional machinery Charles VII had built to win the war did not dismantle itself when the war ended. The permanent tile kept generating revenue. The Compagnie d'Ordonnance kept training and patrolling. The Bureau brothers kept improving their artillery. Charles used the same standing army that had expelled the English to suppress his own great nobles. The 1465 League of the Public Weal, in which the princes tried to roll back royal centralization, was defeated by the same professional force that had won at Castillon. The war had been the crucible in which the French centralized state was forged. What emerged from it was a monarchy that could, for the first time, seriously claim to monopolize armed force within its own borders. The human cost across the century was staggering in ways that contemporary arithmetic could not capture. The regions of northern France that had been the principal theaters of war, Normandy, the Loire Valley, Picardy, the areas around Paris, had been devastated by repeated chevauchées, routier raids, occupation, siege, and the secondary effects of agricultural collapse. Some villages disappeared entirely and were not rebuilt for generations. Forests reclaimed farmland that had been cleared by patient labor over centuries. The areas that recovered fastest were those with monasteries or large churches wealthy enough to fund rebuilding. The areas that recovered slowest were the ones that had been hit hardest in the 1450s, still recording properties as destroyed in administrative documents written a generation after the fighting stopped. In both countries, the war had accelerated changes in the relationship between crown and subject that would define the next 2 centuries. English parliaments had been granted unprecedented leverage over royal taxation because every king from Edward III onward had needed money and had had to ask for it. That leverage became the foundation on which parliamentary power grew, slowly and with many reversals, into the system that eventually produced the constitutional monarchy of the 17th century. England did not develop a standing army until Cromwell, a direct consequence of a political culture that had learned, through the experience of the 100 Years' War, to be deeply suspicious of a crown with independent military resources. France moved in precisely the opposite direction. The permanent tile and the Compagnie d'Ordonnance had freed the French crown from needing to negotiate with its great lords or its estates for military funding. Louis XI, Charles VII's son, used that freedom ruthlessly, absorbing Burgundy after the death of Charles the Bold in 1477, steadily reducing the autonomy of the great noble houses, building a royal administration that was answerable to the crown rather than to local power. The French monarchy that would eventually produce Versailles and Louis XIV, absolute, centralized, glittering with royal authority, had its institutional origins in the emergency measures of a king fighting a 100-year war from a court at Bourges. The war changed what both countries thought they were. English ceased to be a secondary language of the English nobility. French had been the tongue of the court and the aristocracy since the Norman conquest, but the long antagonism with France made that cultural attachment untenable. English identity was sharpened against French identity across generations of mutual hostility. The French identity that emerged was similarly hardened, not the diffuse regional loyalties of 1297, but something that could be invoked against an external enemy, that could explain why a peasant girl from Lorraine would travel to Chinon to save a king she had never met. Both nations came out of the war more coherent, more self-aware, and more hostile to each other than they had entered it. England's last formal claim to French territory, a strip around Calais known as the Pale, survived until January 1558, when a lightning French assault under the Duke of Guise reduced the ring of fortresses in a week. Calais fell on the 7th of January. Mary I, the English queen, reportedly said that when she died, Calais would be found written on her heart. It had been English for 210 years, since Edward III had expelled the French population and resettled it with English colonists after his great siege of 1346 to 1347. With its fall, England had no foothold left on the European continent at all. The Plantagenet Empire, which had stretched from the Channel to the Pyrenees in the 12th century, had been completely erased. The English kings continued to style themselves kings of France until 1799, when the title was finally dropped from the royal style by an act of Parliament, a concession to the realities of the post-revolutionary world and a tacit acknowledgement that the claim had meant nothing for 3.5 centuries. By the time it was dropped, it was a constitutional oddity that legal scholars puzzled over and ordinary people had long forgotten. But for the men who had fought at Crécy and Poitiers and Agincourt, for the men who had burned the Normandy countryside and starved Calais into submission and taken a French king prisoner on a September afternoon outside Poitiers, the claim had been real. They had believed they were winning a kingdom. What they were doing, without knowing it, was making 2 nations. The 100 Years' War ended the medieval order of Western Europe not by any single dramatic transformation, but by the accumulation of 116 years of violence, taxation, plague, civil war, and institutional improvisation. Feudal armies had been replaced by professional ones. Castle walls had been made obsolete by artillery. Royal authority had been extended into corners of both kingdoms where it had never reliably reached. The Church's intermediary role in international affairs had been bypassed by diplomacy conducted between national courts. The aristocratic monopoly on military leadership had been broken by the Bureau brothers, by Du Guesclin, by Joan of Arc, by people who had no business commanding armies. In the old reckoning, and who turned out to be the best commanders of their age,